All right, so it looks like it is 15 minutes after the hour. Catherine, should I go ahead and get started? Looks like it. Okay, well, thank you for joining this session. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation that we will hopefully have at the end where you'll be able to bring in your questions. Just to let everyone know, I have put the deck link into the chat and I've enabled commenting in the deck link. So, Catherine, should I hold on about 5 more minutes? Well, I think it's okay. If anyone comes in a little bit late, I think it's okay because there will still be plenty of information and the deck is available, and I'll reshare that link, and the Q&A will hopefully be a big part of this particular session. But there is a Q&A tab in Hopin if you're new to this, if this is your first day at DrupalCon. And if you post any questions in there that you have during the course of the talk, that will be great. I'm going to try to leave time at the end for us to have a conversation. And please feel free to use that. You can use the chat as well, although I might miss your question and I really don't want to do that. So moving into the talk. For those who don't know me, I'm Rain Michaels. I'm a certified professional in web accessibility, and I'm an interaction designer at Google. I'm also one of the Drupal core topic maintainers for accessibility. And then I've also very recently joined the W3C's WCAG Accessibility Guidelines Working Group and Cognitive Accessibility Task Force. And I'm happy to answer questions about the work that's happening there as well. I do need to say at the front of this conversation that I am speaking as myself, not on behalf of Drupal or the W3C. So everything presented here are my own ideas and thoughts. And then with that, I will go ahead and move on. I'm very sorry about the time difficulty. So anyone who joins at 20 minutes after the hour, hopefully we'll be able to catch you up and that you won't really miss anything important. But we're going to start out with a story about my mother. So why is this important? It's important for just the reality that we have so many diverse people out there in the world. What we're going to talk about today is how do we include that diverse range of people. We've been talking about including kind of diversity and thinking about language and culture and ethnicity and gender. This is a conversation that hopefully many of us have been having for quite some time now, although obviously it still needs to be had more. But we're going to take this another step, and we're going to talk about including people of differing abilities into our research in our work as we're building Drupal sites and we're building solutions that are meant to reach people. A lot of us work with government organizations. The work that we do is something that provides essential services to citizens within countries, maybe services to students. And the types of people who need to interact with what we create are just different in so many different ways, including in their both physical and cognitive abilities. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my mom. My mom is blind. She's also impacted by severe chronic pain and illness, which makes it very difficult for her to do anything. This difficulty is not just a physical difficulty. She has severe tremors when she's trying to interact with interfaces, for example. So she has the struggle with vision. She has the struggle with tremors. But the pain also sort of interferes with her on a cognitive level. If you've ever experienced severe pain, you know that in those moments, you're not necessarily able to kind of have all of your cognitive functioning at the level that you would like it to be as you're engaging. On the other hand, my mom is also someone who is absolutely an internet user. In fact, she's 100% dependent on the internet for things like her food or shopping, for things like reading, for accessing the news. this is how she's able to get these essential services, paying her bills. These are things that she cannot do any other way with any sort of ease unless somebody else helps her. So in order to be an independent human being, she relies on the systems that we're building, which means that she is exactly the kind of person who should be part of any user studies, user testing, any sort of foundational or strategy sessions that we have as we're coming up with what our solutions or products will be or how they'll be built. I want to clarify that this particular talk is not necessarily Drupal specific. In fact, it's not Drupal specific at all. This is really for kind of everyone who's building digital and web-based interfaces. But from my standpoint, as a Drupal core accessibility topic maintainer, I know that the kinds of questions that I hope to be answering in this session are ones that come up very frequently from module creators, contributors, core contributors, as well as people who build Drupal sites. And the sort of challenge of, well, okay, Rain, you're telling me I need to get people like your mom into my sort of workflow to make sure that my products work for your mom. And you say, but I have no idea how to do that. So the reason why I felt like this was something to bring to DrupalCon, even though it's not necessarily specific to Drupal, is because it's a question that every Drupal developer, a site builder needs to have in mind, and does, but doesn't really know how to move forward because it is fairly complicated. So we'll start off with something from the CDC, a quote from the CDC, Disability and Health Promotion, which says, activities and participation can be made easier or more difficult as a result of environmental factors, such as technology, support and relationships, services, policies, or the beliefs of others. And this is super important. The World Health Organization is now defining disability not as not under sort of a historical medical model, what it used to be considered, where you sort of look at somebody as having something wrong with them, but rather from a social model where we look at the world and we say, okay, here's a human being. They are in this moment disabled because of the built environment, and the supports around them are not actually built in a way that they can access. So it's sort of turning the table around and saying, okay, no, we're not saying that there's something wrong with anybody. There's not something wrong with anybody. These are human beings who need access to the things that we build. But how we build them can basically create the experience of disability because of what somebody's differing abilities might be. So that's where this quote comes from. So as we're thinking about actually bringing people into our experiences and into our testing, our research, our process, thinking about our strategy and what we're actually going to build, what our solution's going to be, what's our future going to be, there are some high-level considerations that we want to take in mind. When we're thinking about the people that we want to bring in mind, in addition to thinking about making sure that we have a broad sort of cultural, national, language, gender as variation in the people that we bring in, we also want to make sure that we're bringing in a diverse range of age groups, socioeconomic groups, and also identities and cultures, and also abilities. Physical abilities and cognitive abilities. And another really important piece to this that's often missed, as teams might work really hard to bring in, to make sure that they're bringing in individuals who, say, are eyes free or non-sighted, but without intending to, every single person that they bring in who is a non-sighted user might also be very tech savvy and have ample socioeconomic resources available to them. And if that's the case, you're actually not getting a diverse perspective of what it means to be an eyes-free user, because those individuals who may be blind or low vision, who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds, may actually have significantly different experiences and needs than those who have more resources available to them. The other thing that you'll want to make sure at a very high level is, have you actually made it possible for people with differing abilities to participate in the work that you're doing. And this becomes an even more interesting question now that we're doing pretty much everything remote. Hopefully that will start to change soon, and we'll be able to have more high-touch interactions with individuals who might have more complicated and more complex needs. But as we're doing things remote, it kind of becomes a very interesting question. What are we doing? How are we framing these testing environments in order to bring these people in? Another really important consideration is that you may not actually know if you have participants that have differing needs. And this becomes even more true as well in this sort of remote COVID world. I remember I was taking a sort of social class online a few weeks ago with some of my colleagues, and the class began, and it was not a work event, just for fun. And it was an online live class, and the class began, and the woman teaching the class was talking about, was telling us, oh, pick up the bag with the blue rocks. Well, it just so happens that at least 2 of the participants in the class were individuals who are blind. And those 2 individuals now had to actually stand up and say, can you please describe the way that the bag feels, because I can't actually see which one is blue. That didn't need to happen. It honestly did not need to happen in that moment. The person teaching the class had no reason to have to know that these 2 individuals were not able to understand the visual information, or that the visual information was not helpful to them. The individual teaching the class could have simply added the feeling of the rocks, and then the entire class could have happened without her ever knowing that some of the participants were blind. Because in a way, unless it truly matters, unless this is demographic information that you actually need to have, or there are significant ways in which the experience needs to be reframed, it's even more inclusive and remarkable if people can just simply be who they are, and they don't have to sort of wave their hand and say, hey, you're excluding me right now. But that you simply kind of reframe the experience so that you're including the individual organically. That can't always happen, but if it can, it should. And also, when it comes to the cognitive space, you really might not know, because a lot of times cognitive or learning disabilities, these are invisible disabilities that your friends, your family members, people that you interact with, your colleagues, may actually have, and you don't even know, because they do their job well, they exist in their world well, they have their supports for the thing that's difficult for them, and they don't need to necessarily disclose to you, hey, I have severe dyslexia, because they have their own way of sort of succeeding and excelling that's a little bit different from yours. So there's also cases where you simply might not know, somebody may not have disclosed an invisible disability to you. And again, in an ideal world, you shouldn't actually have to know in order to include them. So what does this actually mean? What does inclusion start to look like? First of all, there's physical access. So how do we actually invite people to be able to interact in a physical way with what we're sort of putting in front of them? And I'm framing this off of the concept of user testing, or maybe some kind of a workshop or focus group, something where maybe they're not actually interacting with the site itself, because a lot of the accessibility talks will talk about how to make a Drupal site accessible. So this is more about ways to actually engage with an individual. So first of all, tooling. What are the tools that you're making use of for these user studies, for your testing? Are you using InVision, for example, in order to do testing? Are you using prototypes in Figma? Are you using Simply Test Me? And whatever these tools are that you're using, what video conferencing platform are you using? Does the person know how to use it? Is it accessible to them through a screen reader? Is it accessible through keyboard only, through voice access? Have you turned on captions? Have you invited a sign language interpreter to join and ensured that the sign language interpreter's video screen remains present in your conversation? Also, can you offer an alternative way for an individual to provide input? So in a kind of physical space, or in a design sprint or a workshop, or in sort of a design sprint or workshop that's happening in a remote setting, we'll often ask people to draw pictures of their ideas, or write down their thoughts, and then maybe kind of take pictures of them and upload them if it's remote. But what if an individual is simply more comfortable explaining their ideas? I'll give you a really good example. I've done focus groups with individuals who are in later, not late stages, but not early stages either, of dementia. And these individuals may often find it easier to speak what their thoughts are, rather than to go through the effort of having to draw their thoughts down, or to go through the effort of filling out a form. Or if you're doing an in-person user testing session, and somebody is actually going through the sort of process in your test, in your Drupal site that you're testing, if they're going through that experience, it might actually be a little bit too hard for the individual to literally go through it and click on things. So if you can give them an alternative way to interact, ask them to raise whichever hand is on the side where they would click, for example. Just give them a way to do things where maybe you take control, but have them give you that sort of verbal input in order to make it easier for them. Another aspect of physical access is physical spaces. Can everyone actually get to the physical space? Now, this seems obvious, but there's a couple of nuances to this that I have personally experienced. Just little things like make sure that there's enough room for somebody with a wheelchair, a cane, or a dog to navigate safely and comfortably. This also goes for someone who has sort of sensory challenges, being too close to another person. Make sure that there's enough room physically so that if somebody needs a little bit more space, they can actually make that physical space for themselves. If somebody needs to be in a darker space in the room, that those darker spaces actually exist. Can everyone reach everything in your space? So if you're using, if you're workshopping and you're using something like a whiteboard, maybe think about lowering that whiteboard so that somebody who's in a wheelchair, or somebody who simply needs to sit while interacting with the whiteboard due to exhaustion, is able to do so, because it's also lower. And then is there enough space as well to, well, we actually talked about sort of giving individuals that privacy, or preventing that sensory overload of physical closeness. Then there's also information, the sort of category of information access. How do we make sure that content is actually available for people in multiple senses? So when we're doing things like this, like a verbal conversation where you're also seeing my face, we can verbalize information that's presented through body language. So if I'm asked a question and I nod my head in response, that is now only going to be available to those individuals who happen to be seeing my nod, and who not only can physically see my nod, but also those individuals who sort of need more information about what we call implied content. So there are some individuals who may not be able to understand that a shaking of the head no, I'm currently shaking my head no, or nodding of the head yes, I'm currently nodding my head yes. People might not actually understand what that means. So they may not be able to see it, or they may not be able to process it and understand that that means yes or no. So ensuring that you're kind of doing both. You're doing the nod and you're saying the yes, or you're typing the yes, or you're putting it into some form that can be accessed through another sensory input, and that can kind of de-abstractify. I think I just made up that word, but sort of remove the abstraction or remove the implication and make it concrete and say, okay, this is a yes or a no. I'm giving a thumbs up, which means I approve. I'm giving a thumbs down, which means I don't approve. And sort of giving those multiple inputs at the same time. Also, really ensuring that your decks have adequate alt text within them. Your emails, there is, I don't remember the name of it, there is an extension that you can use to put alt text into images in your emails so that you can make that more accessible as well. And when possible, distributing materials ahead of time so that people have time to kind of pre-process it if they're simply individuals who need more time. Also, this one's interesting, sort of thinking about participant visibility. So should participants want to be seen and see other participants, do they actually have the opportunity to see each other? Some participants may actually need help setting up screens ahead of time so that they can be seen, or so that they can kind of see everyone and access materials. So for example, somebody might need help setting up 2 screens so that they can sort of see you on one screen and see the material on another, because they may actually be somebody who really desperately relies on that sort of physical behavior in order to understand your meaning. They might sort of take the combination of the visual and the verbal together to create meaning. And another thing to think about, though, is to make sure that those individuals who might not know if they are framed correctly or have enough lighting, that you help them to set up their experience so that their camera picks them up adequately and their lighting picks them up adequately so that their facial expressions can be seen. Some individuals rely heavily on lip reading. I actually have a friend who's completely deaf who does not use sign language at all because she's actually sort of traveled around 3 different countries that all have 3 different sign language, 3 different languages that are sign language. So she never learned sign language because that was just kind of too much for her to flip-flop around. So she relies 100% on lip reading in order to understand what people are saying. So not excluding her because she doesn't have access to those lips is very important. And then also thinking about content formatting. So look at your content and say, well, is this easy to skim? Is it easy to understand the language? Am I using language that's clear as opposed to relying on metaphors? Am I keeping my paragraphs short so that an individual who might be overwhelmed by or lost in long paragraphs won't get lost in them? Do I have good headers and semantic markup? Am I using clear typography, good line heights? This seems like simple best practices in design, and it really is. And hopefully this is in your Drupal site. But I often see this fall apart in email communications when reaching out to participants to help them understand what's happening. Or Word docs or Google Docs, they just become these like massive overwhelm of words, and they're not well formatted, and you sort of, I actually do have a bit of a reading disability, and when I get those Word docs, I feel a certain amount of anxiety and overwhelm. And so to kind of help prevent that for your users and just welcome them in by saying, you know what, I actually took time to put headers into my document and to give it a nice line height and to make sure that my paragraphs are no more than 4 to 5 lines long, ideally less, but no more than that. And that things that can be list items are list items. And that alone feels so welcoming when somebody takes that, just a moment, those few extra steps to do that. It just brings people in so much more. We talked a little bit about sensory considerations, but sensory overwhelm is a really important consideration. It really fits in with what are often invisible disabilities within the workplace. You probably have multiple colleagues who you yourself may also have some sensory challenges where you simply, might be a sound that's just too overwhelming for you, a light flickering, even in a video conferencing setting. In fact, the captions themselves could be a sensory overload. We've turned them on so that they can be part of the recording, but some people might actually need to cover them up because just the simple act of this thing kind of constantly moving as the words play out on the screen can be sensory overload for individuals. So to consider all of those points where it's like, here's something that kind of keeps going, here's a sound, here's a movement, and trying to really be considerate of the fact that that could actually impact somebody, and where possible to be able to turn those things off. So thinking about ambiance, is it possible to dim the lighting to make it brighter? If there's noise that persists in a location or on somebody's video call, is there a way to turn it off or mute it if it proves disruptive? And if anything is sort of flickering or moving a lot, those are some of the things to consider. Also thinking about flexibility. And this really does go also to sensory overload and including people with invisible disabilities. Also things like anxiety or PTSD or sheer exhaustion. Somebody had a baby 3 months ago and they didn't sleep for 2 nights in a row. Allowing people to actually participate when we go back to being in person, allowing people to participate in your workshops remotely as well and still feel like they're included will be amazing. So things like this might look like having, you know, your conference room where everybody's together, but then leaving a chair open where you have the screen for the person and you set up the camera well for the person who wants to participate remote, and making that possible. The other really cool thing about this is it makes it easier for you to bring in participants who might have very complex physical needs, such as somebody who might not be ambulatory, might actually be sort of refined to some kind of a bed, maybe somebody with recent traumatic brain injury that you would like to bring into your experience who simply can't leave the space that they're in, but you know that they have a lot to contribute and you want to bring them in and get feedback from them. Then there are also complex communication needs, and this one is more complex. It takes a lot to learn how to use augmentative and alternative communications, what we call AAC. It also takes a lot to learn how to understand these devices, but it's something to think about. So if you're bringing somebody in with complex communication needs, you will know, everyone will know, because the individual will be significantly more difficult to understand. The person will need a lot more time to speak, and sometimes the person might be using another device to create speech, an AAC or augmentative and alternative communication device. If you're bringing one of these people in, which I really hope you do, because they have so much to share and they're often under asked because it is harder to listen to them, just build in extra time. Reduce your expectations to about a quarter of what you go in thinking you might want to get. Narrow it down to a single question. More information will come out of that encounter than the answer to that single question. But reduce your expectations so that you can allow it to move the way that it needs to, and you can let that person feel invited. Keep in mind that that person is working exceptionally hard, and I can't underestimate this. They are working so hard in order to share their voice with you that the least you can do is be patient and listen. Take time and just let them talk rather than trying to jump in and finish their sentences for them. I personally struggle when I have to wait. So I use a stimming device. If I need to wait and I need my sort of energy to go somewhere in order to stop myself from doing something bad, like interrupting someone, I can sit here and I can stim all I want, and all that energy can go in here, and then I can let that person talk to me, and I can respect and give them the dignity of taking the time that they might need to take. Also, avoid defaulting to another person to translate. It's such an easy thing to do, to say, you know what, I really didn't understand them. Can you translate for me? Please don't. If you didn't understand the person, ask them to help you understand. And it might take time. But if you ask for somebody else to translate for them, A, you're really getting that person's translation instead. And B, you might actually unintentionally silence that person because they might not be willing to talk anymore. Also, I just really want to remind you, you might not know when you go into these settings, you might not know if somebody has a need. So if you're unsure, if you need to know because maybe you are using Figma and you know that certain things can't really be done in Figma or in Mural, but you really want to use those tools for some reason, ask. Find out if your participants, and ask all of your participants rather than just asking one individual. say, hey, you know, I suspect you might have different needs. Ask everybody. Just say, hey, you know, this is the tool we're going to use. Here's some of my concerns about what may not be accessible about it. Would anyone like to propose an alternative, or is there kind of another way to interact? And make it a conversation. The big question that everyone asks me, how do we find participants? And this is a hard one. So first of all, when it comes to cognitive, so when it comes to actual like kind of disabilities in general, the current sort of guess from the World Health Organization is that 1 in 4 people currently have sort of permanent or declared disabilities. So I'm sure you know a lot of people, which means you actually do know a lot of people who have some kind of a disability, and who will make your group more diverse if you sort of actively reach out for those individuals. These people exist among you. I know probably many of you have known me for years, and you probably never knew that I do have, and what I'm now disclosing as a mild reading disability. Maybe you guessed because you heard me say something weird. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. Like these people are out there. We exist as human beings in all of our sort of differences. On the other hand, individuals with disabilities are, we call it sort of double taxed, in that first, these individuals are simply trying to kind of exist and do their lives with whatever sort of accommodations that they've made for themselves, which might be more difficult. And then people come to them regularly saying, hey, can you help me with this? Can you give me feedback on this? Can you do this? Can you do this? Without any kind of agreement for compensation. So it's sort of extra work. They're taken advantage of. We hear this from communities of color often as well, that communities of color are sort of often asked to be their own advocates all the time. And it's a really kind of overwhelming and exhausting. So consider this. If you have resources to pay, please do. If you don't, then consider reaching out to community groups. There are a lot of organizations around you locally. If you do a Google search, you'll find them. Look for organizations that do sort of day care for individuals with dementia. Look for sort of day programs or job training programs for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these programs may actually have other ways that you can actually give back while asking them for something in turn. And for the job programs, the job training programs, that might actually be simply giving them an opportunity to experience work in a sort of realistic setting, so that they have something that they can put on their resume, which is almost no cost to you. But it's a way to give back in a substantial and meaningful way, whilst not taking advantage of the individuals. Also, it's very important to keep in mind consent, and to know that there's a difference between consent and assent. Some individuals are not able to give consent for themselves, and it's not your job to determine capacity for consent. That's something that you're going to need to understand, whether or not the people that you're working with have legal guardians. And if they do, you're going to have to make sure that you have consent from the legal guardian, and assent, meaning an affirmation of willingness to participate from the individual themselves. And if they don't have legal guardians, then you will want to get consent, genuine consent from the individual. And you'll also want to give them opportunities to change their mind along the way. That's what I've got. I wanted to leave more time for questions. I'm certainly happy to hang around, but we do still have 2 minutes, and I see that there are some questions in the Q&A. So I'll switch over to that. Ivan asks, what resources do you know of that do accessibility reviews of software products? For example, evaluating video conferencing options and comparing how accessible and inclusive they are. You know what, I apologize, Ivan, I don't have a good answer to this question. Maybe somebody else on this talk does, if someone wants to add a comment in the chat. The reason why I don't have a good answer to this question is because I actually work with another team who does the reviews rather than me. So I don't have a good answer to that. I very much apologize. But it's a good question. Benji's asking, my Drupal meetup has someone with a stutter. Does that count as a complex communication need? No, actually, it doesn't necessarily. So everybody kind of exists on some kind of continuum. We sort of all live on a spectrum, and it depends on the nature of the stutter. Is the individual, are you able to understand the individual when they speak with ease, or do you have to work exceptionally hard to understand them? When they speak, are they able to speak what they intend to speak, or is it exceptionally difficult for them to find the right word for what they're intending to say? Or is it difficult for them to actually physically craft the word itself? And this is where we get into the complex communication needs. Somebody who may need to communicate in some other form, or who simply may need more time. The other interesting thing about complex communication needs is that for some individuals with sort of difficulty actually forming words, who may be very hard to understand, is you will find that if you are interacting with the same person over a period of time, eventually you will learn how to understand them. It's just, it takes time, it takes practice, it takes work. So they will, for you, become easier to understand, and your interactions with them will become easier over time. But a stutter in itself, it can, a stutter can make it harder to speak, yes. A stutter can introduce a level of sort of self-consciousness and embarrassment. And so helping that individual just know that you really don't care if they stutter. It's just part of them. It's who they are, and it doesn't make them any less different, awkward. That's the way to really kind of help somebody who might have difficulty with a stutter, but not necessarily difficulty kind of finding words or communicating in a more complex way. Nicholas asks, in our work, accessibility is rarely a priority for our clients. Do you have any advices to convince decision makers, budget managers to invest in such notions? Oh, it's a heartbreaking question. It's a reality. You know, before I work at Google in the central accessibility team, and I don't have to convince anybody of anything. And it feels like kind of this magical space for me to be in. But before that, I definitely had plenty of experiences with what you're referring to. And ultimately, the easiest kind of stick, if we're talking about kind of the abstract concept of the carrot and the stick, giving the person the sort of thing that's going to reward them, and then giving the person the thing that will kind of punish them into doing something, is to really think about or really bring up the laws. There are laws all around the world for making things accessible to people with varying abilities. Those laws are exceptionally sound in places like Japan and Israel and the UK. They're pretty solid in the US as well. And there's a lot of other places as well where the laws are really your best tool to say, hey, you are susceptible to a lawsuit. What comes with a lawsuit is embarrassment, loss of trust. The carrot, the sort of reward, though, is I think people really underestimate how many people we're talking about, what kind of a market size. So if you go to the World Health Organization website, you'll find the statistics that show 1 in 4 people in the world. That's a massive market. Or if we think about aging, I believe it's 2025 is the year where we're going to have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18 in the world. And aging itself comes with some changes in physical and cognitive ability. And the older populations tend to be the ones with more money, with more market share. So that's a really good kind of argument to say, hey, look, these are the people that we want coming to our Drupal site. And if we don't do this work, then in a few years, suddenly we're only going to be able to successfully reach this small number of people, and the rest of this market won't be available to us because they won't be able to use these tools very well. So that's what I would say is the way to do it. There is the WCAG. Let me get you the link for the quick ref guidelines. WCAG quick ref. I'll just get you this link and post it in the chat. Unless somebody already did. Oh, there we go. So that's a good kind of reference point for the basis of a lot of the international laws that are out there and what the requirements might be considered if somebody decides to take you to court. Michael has a comment here. I have seen internal comms and later public events spotlighting of enlightened manager mentors being an effective way to get more people interested in supporting disabled employees. That's a wonderful comment. I'd like to expand on that and just say that once people actually understand the challenges that individuals are faced with, they really start to become more desiring of fixing their tooling to be more inclusive. It's really, most people want to include and be good. And it's really kind of one of the biggest obstacles is just that people don't realize how hard it can be for individuals. I want to acknowledge that it's 56 minutes after the hour. So some of you might be hoping to jump off to another session. And so if you'd like to do that, please do, but I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer to answer more questions. And I also just want to point out that Kristen posted a survey to please provide feedback, and I'll just repost that link here. And then for anyone who needs it, let me repost the deck link as well here. But I'm happy to stick around and talk a little bit more. So I see another question came in. We sometimes get layouts like sliders and tabs that really require mouse interaction. Evans posted this. Are there any sources you can think of that give ideas of how to make these layouts more accessible? That's a great one. So sliders and tabs are not necessarily mouse specific. They can actually be built in order to allow for keyboard navigation, which then also exposes switch access. So somebody who might be using an external switch device. I like to, no, it's not in my drawer anymore. I have a little PlayStation switch that I sometimes hook up to my system to demonstrate switch access and what that's like. So it's something that you might want to play with. And just make sure that your layouts will actually work both with keyboard only as well as with switch access. What I would suggest that you do is go back to your designers for those layouts with the tabs and the sliders and ask them what the tab order needs to be for getting to those items and what the accessibility labels are, especially on the sliders. What will be read out by a screen reader if somebody is eyes free and using a keyboard. What is the label if somebody needs to use voice access to actually engage with the interface? What is the text that they actually need to be able to say? So push back on your designers and ask them to put that information into the layouts that they give you. Let's see if I've missed anything so far, but that's a good one. Thank you. Introducing accessibility in the design and early development process is a great way to maximize developer efficiency and compliance. Excellent point. The remediation after the fact, meaning going in and adding accessibility back in once you discover that it's not accessible, it creates two problems. One is it's exceptionally developer heavy, it's hard, it takes a long time, which means it's expensive. It also creates what I like to refer to as sort of a Franken experience, referring to the character Frankenstein, who's sort of, well, actually Frankenstein's monster, not Frankenstein, because Frankenstein was the doctor, right? So the monster is kind of a compilation of a lot of different pieces put together. And when you have to remediate for accessibility after the fact, not only does it become this sort of Franken experience for your users who need those accessibility sort of elements built in, but it could also become a Franken experience for everybody. If a designer is probably not going to be satisfied with the changes because it will probably have a negative impact on the design and the artistry. So really coming at it from the very beginning is the least expensive, most efficient, and most successful way to do this. And maybe even will result in something where it doesn't even look like you tried, but it becomes a much more accessible experience. Which is not to say that accessibility is easy, even if done from the beginning. It's not. It does take a lot of work, and I want to acknowledge that. Also, I'm hoping the developer community moves, this is from Piotr, I'm hoping the developer community moves in an accessibility first development process similar to how mobile first movement occurred when mobile devices started getting popular. Yes, absolutely. And the mobile first movement actually is such a huge advance in accessibility as well, because for users who need to zoom in and see things a lot closer, it's really created a much more accessible experience for a lot of people. So that in itself has been a great advance forward. Looking at the Q&A here, I think I've gotten to all of the questions. There's still a number of people on this particular session. So if you have more questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Let me give you my email address as well. Oh, there's my email address. If you email me and I don't get back to you, feel free to ping me again. And it's great seeing some familiar individuals. Thank you for saying hi and for being here. So I look forward to finding out more about what you do, seeing what you build. Super excited about that. Hi, Kristen. Thanks for joining. Thank you. And Molly, thank you for posting the link to the survey again. Thank you. Also, for anyone who's still here, we do have accessibility office hours this Thursday. Let me get that link too. Office hours. Here it is. So Thursday, April 15th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. I don't see any more questions coming in, so I'm going to sign off, but I look forward to hearing from you, seeing you, and talking with you again.